Isabella sat back in her chair, staring at the chart on her computer monitor. The trend line, which had been rising at a promising pace, was now in free fall. She tried to ignore the butterflies in her stomach, the feeling that something was wrong. But news was starting to spread. The market was reacting in unexpected ways to the investment in which she had invested almost all of the family's capital. She had always considered herself a rational, calculating woman. As a successful financial consultant, her decisions were based on data, projections, and rigorous analysis. But something about this investment felt different, special. The urge to take a risk and get an even higher return than usual seduced her. Isabella believed it would be a smart move, a calculated risk, but as time went on, the expansion project she had financed failed, and with it, her hopes of a quick and easy profit. Carlos, her husband, appeared at the office door, his face grim. He was coming from an important meeting, and for a moment she allowed herself to think that he might have a solution to all this. But when she saw his serious expression, an extra weight settled in the air. "What did you do, Isabella?" he asked, his voice firm and sharp. Isabella hesitated, trying to find an explanation that sounded convincing, but the words seemed to get lost along the way. "I did what I thought was best," she tried, but her voice sounded weak, lacking confidence. Carlos approached her, his gaze distant. "This mistake will destroy everything, you know that, don't you?" Silence filled the room. Isabella looked at the computer, the losses mounting before her eyes. There was no more room for justifications. She knew the project had failed. Shame began to take over her body. How could she have been so blind? How could she not see that that risk, in fact, had not been calculated at all? Carlos sighed and turned to leave. He paused at the door before he left and said something that would echo in her mind for weeks. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Isabella. This wasn't a financial mistake. It was a lapse in judgment." He closed the door behind him, and Isabella was left alone, the word failure echoing in her mind, like a weight she never imagined carrying. The next morning came with a heavy silence. Isabella couldn't stop reliving the scene from the previous night. Carlos had gone to sleep in a separate room, and the physical distance seemed the perfect metaphor for the emotional distance that now separated them. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to organize her thoughts, but everything seemed tangled. Every time she tried to justify her mistake, a wave of shame would take over her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed, not only financially, but also as a wife, as a partner. At breakfast, tension hung in the air. Carlos walked into the kitchen and sat down without saying a word. Isabella tried to find something to say, but each sentence seemed irrelevant in the face of the gravity of the situation. Carlos's words still reverberated in her mind, and she knew he could no longer look at her the same way. "I didn't expect this from you, Isabella," Carlos said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was cold, more distant than she had ever imagined it could be. "Investing our money like this, without consulting me, without even thinking about the consequences, there's no going back now. You know that, don't you?" Isabella had no answer. There was no longer any way to deny the gravity of the mistake, but she still tried to find some explanation, something that could make Carlos understand. "I thought it would be a good opportunity, Carlos. I researched, I planned, I thought it would be safe." Carlos didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup, as if her presence was just an inconvenience. "You were so focused on growing, on multiplying, that you forgot to see the risk. You never listened to me, Isabella. You never consulted me. I'm not an investor who likes risk. You haven't learned anything from our past mistakes. How can you expect me to continue trusting you after this?" Carlos's tone was cruel, but the truth in his words was even more painful. Isabella wanted to scream, apologize, say she was sorry, but at that moment she knew that words weren't enough. He didn't want to hear any more excuses. He wanted to see results. He wanted to see trust. And she felt like that trust had been irreparably destroyed. The conversation continued, but her words no longer carried the same weight. She felt small, irrelevant. Not just a woman who had made a financial mistake, but a woman who had failed in her most important role, that of being a reliable partner. As Carlos got up from the table and retreated to his office, Isabella felt a sense of abandonment settle in her chest. She knew that something much deeper than a financial mistake was at stake. Their relationship was fractured, and what had once seemed like a solid union was now torn apart by her failure. Not only was money at stake, but also trust, the foundation on which their marriage had been built. She felt a tear run down her face, but there was no one there to wipe it away. There was no Carlos to offer comfort. Only the oppressive silence and shame of a woman who felt increasingly distant from who she really was. The silence in the house was deafening. During the following days, Isabella found herself sinking deeper into her own solitude. Carlos avoided interacting with her as much as possible, and the coldness that emanated from his gaze every time he crossed paths was harder to bear than any argument. Isabella spent her days secluded in the office, trying to find a solution to the financial losses, but in truth, she was only procrastinating the inevitable. Guilt consumed her inside as she tried to redo the accounts, but the mistake was beyond repair. When the phone rang that day, she hesitated before answering. The unfamiliar number displayed on the screen only increased her apprehension. As she picked up the receiver, a male voice on the other end of the line made her heart race. "Isabella, I'm Rodrigo from the project. We need to talk." "What happened?" His voice was firm, but there was a tension that made her realize it wouldn't be an easy conversation. I know. The project didn't work out," she replied, trying to remain calm. "But it wasn't for lack of effort. Market conditions have changed. The crisis has hit harder than I anticipated." Rodrigo interrupted her with a word that made her stomach churn. Fraud. She was speechless for a moment, trying to process what he was saying. "What?" was all she could manage to mutter. "The investment wasn't just a market error, Isabella. There are irregularities in the numbers. Someone is trying to cover up an even bigger flaw, and investors are starting to question it. We need answers, and we need them now." Her words came out as a whisper. I didn't know that, Rodrigo. I trusted the project. I went deep into the analysis, but I didn't see it. I couldn't have seen it." Rodrigo was silent for a few seconds, and then his voice, deeper, was heard again. "That doesn't justify your failure. It's not just the money now. It's your reputation and the reputation of everyone involved." Isabella felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She knew that this mistake that now seemed so small compared to what was to come, could destroy everything she had built. What would be left of her when the scandal grew even bigger? She hung up the phone, her hands shaking, the feeling of shame eating away at her body. But what hurt the most was the fact that she knew Carlos was right. The trust he had placed in her had been completely shattered, not only by his actions, but by the way she had neglected her responsibility as a manager, as a wife, and as a person. With each passing day, she found herself more trapped in this cycle of denial and regret. She tried to talk to Carlos, but he avoided her. Rodrigo's words still echoed in her mind, and now she felt lost, with no clear path forward. The pressure to resolve the situation, to restore trust, felt more and more overwhelming. But at that moment, something inside her clicked. She knew she could try to get back up, maybe not to fix everything, but at least to make something out of that devastating fall. The first thing she needed to do was face the consequences head-on. No more excuses. The responsibility had to be hers. Isabella stood up, looked out the window, and saw the cloudy sky. What was to come would not be easy. She knew that, but if there was anything left, it would be the chance to fight for her honor, her dignity, and perhaps her relationship with Carlos, although she knew that this would be the greatest challenge of all. Isabella didn't know where to begin. After her conversation with Rodrigo, she felt an urgency that consumed her but also paralyzed her. How could she solve something so complex? How could she save her reputation, her marriage, after everything that had happened? The pressure of not being able to give a clear answer, of not being able to reverse the damage done, tormented her. She decided that the first step would be to be transparent, not only with Carlos, but with herself. She knew it was time to face her mistakes head-on. To try to fix them, she would need to take full responsibility. When Carlos got home that night, Isabella was waiting for him in the living room. She knew he didn't expect anything different. He didn't believe her words anymore. But she had to try. She had to open her heart. "Carlos," she began, her voice breaking. He looked at her wearily, but didn't say anything, just waited. I messed up. I made a mistake. A serious mistake. I was so focused on increasing our financial security, on giving you and our children a better life, that I ignored the signs. I know you can't trust me anymore right now, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Carlos was silent, and Isabella couldn't tell what he was thinking. He looked at the ground, and for a moment she felt like all hope was gone. But then he looked up, and his words, though harsh, told her something different. Something Isabella hadn't expected to hear. "I don't know if this will work, Isabella. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. But if you're really willing to do whatever it takes, then start now. Not with words, with actions." He turned and went to the office, leaving Isabella alone with her own thoughts. His last sentence echoed in her mind. With actions. There would be no more empty excuses or promises of change. Now she would have to show Carlos and herself that she was capable of turning the situation around. In the days that followed, Isabella began to act more diligently. Instead of just trying to sort out her finances and look for new investment opportunities, she sought help. She contacted those responsible for auditing the project and sought out a specialized team to deal with the irregularities mentioned by Rodrigo. Even though she knew there was no guarantee of success, she knew she had to give it her all. During a meeting with the audit team, Isabella heard the gravity of the situation. The flaws in the project were, in fact, deeper than she had imagined. The investigations showed evidence of data manipulation and false information to deceive investors. The scandal was about to spread, and although Isabella had not been directly responsible, she could not escape responsibility. Her negligent supervision made her partly to blame for the fiasco. When she returned home that day, the weight of the situation was heavier than ever. She knew the future was uncertain, but there was something in her mind that motivated her. Carlos's word was still with her, attitudes, and she did not want to give in to defeat. Isabella somehow had awakened something within herself, a strength that was hidden, a strength she never knew she had, but that now proved unbeatable. When she entered the house, she saw Carlos in the living room. He was watching TV, but his posture was rigid. Isabella knew he was waiting to see if she would actually take concrete action. She looked at him, took a deep breath and said, "I'm doing what I can, Carlos, but I know I can do more. I'm going after the solution, not just financially, but in everything I can fix. I'm committed to fixing this, and I'm going to prove that I can restore trust." Carlos didn't say anything right away. He just watched her carefully. Isabella knew he wouldn't believe her words, but she wanted him to see the sincerity in her eyes. She knew she would have to be consistent in her actions. Words were insufficient now. Isabella retreated to her office and spent the night working. She faced a monumental challenge, but she was determined to fight, not only to correct her mistake, but to regain everything she had lost: her dignity, Carlos's respect, and above all, the feeling that she could still rebuild the trust that seemed to have vanished. In the following days, Isabella threw herself headfirst into her work. The office became her refuge, her battlefield, where she fought against the ghosts of mistakes and shame. Every email she sent, every meeting she attended were like desperate attempts to turn the situation around, to rescue something that deep down seemed irretrievable. But she couldn't stop. Not anymore. She knew that if she gave in to despair, she would lose everything. Meanwhile, Carlos was distant. He didn't express anger or disgust, but his emotional absence was as clear as the reality unfolding before them. He began to be absent for longer periods of time, working late, as if the pressure of work were an escape from the anguish of living with Isabella, or perhaps a reflection of the insecurity he felt about the continuation of their marriage. She could feel the gulf between them widening with each passing day, but she didn't know how to bridge it. That Friday, Isabella received a call that made her shiver. It was Rodrigo. The gravity of his voice foreshadowed the storm that was about to break out over her. Isabella, the case regarding the project has taken on immense proportions. The report you requested is ready, but investors won't wait much longer. We have a deadline to deliver definitive answers, and we are already beginning to feel the legal effects. There is a risk of legal involvement. I know you are trying to correct this, but we need to act quickly. Isabella felt the weight of the news like a physical blow. What had seemed like a distant possibility now became a real threat. The risk of legal action was before her, and the consequences were not just financial. If the scandal were to take shape, the public exposure could be devastating. She realized that the problems were beyond her control. It was a storm, and she was in its eye. Night fell, and with it came the feeling of impending doom. The house seemed emptier than ever. Carlos wasn't there, and Isabella didn't know if that was a relief or torture. She needed to talk to him, needed him to know she was struggling, but she feared that any attempt to get closer would be in vain. When Carlos arrived later, he entered silently, without looking at her. Isabella was on the couch, staring into space, her hands cold and her thoughts clouded. He saw her, but made no move to approach her. She felt a crushing weight on her chest. He was moving away, and she knew that there were no more words that could repair what was broken between them. Finally, he spoke, without sitting down, with a coldness that cut through the air. "Isabella, I saw the report. What's happening is much more serious than you told me. I can't go on like this, watching you drown in a lie, trying to fix everything with words and more words. I love you, but this is beyond anything I can understand." Isabella didn't know how to respond. Those words hit her with the force of an unforgiving truth. She tried to stand up, but her legs were weak. "I know you're angry. I know I did everything wrong, but I'm trying, Carlos. I need a chance." Carlos looked her in the eyes. He was tired, exhausted from fighting alone. "I don't know if we have any more chances, Isabella. I don't know. I saw you lose yourself, and now it's too late. I can't help you if you don't help yourself, and I don't know what to do." His words were like a fatal blow. She felt an immense emptiness taking over her. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had lost herself. She had allowed herself to be consumed by her own ambition and mistakes, without realizing the importance of balance, honesty, and trust. She could no longer carry the weight of all that alone. Without another word, he turned and left the room. Isabella stood there in silence. The weight of guilt and loss was unbearable. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible to travel. But one thing she was sure of: she could no longer ignore her responsibilities. Not to Carlos, not to herself. But the storm was just beginning. The scandal was still in its early stages, and the coming days promised to be chaotic. Isabella did not know what the future held for her, but one thing was clear: she could no longer run away from the consequences of her choices. The fight now was not just for redemption, but for the survival of everything she believed was important. Saturday dawned grey, as if the sky wanted to reflect the weight of the reality that Isabella was facing. Her home phone rang non-stop, and each call was a reminder of the gravity of the situation. Rodrigo's messages were becoming more frequent, bringing with them increasingly alarming news. The risk of imminent legal action was not only a possibility, but a near certainty. Investors were losing patience and had already begun to meet to discuss the next step, with or without Isabella's collaboration. She knew she could no longer hide from the storm. Everything around her seemed to be falling apart. But as business collapsed, what was most painful for her was the growing distance between her and Carlos. He was still at home, but his presence was almost non-existent. He left early, came back late, and when he was there, he avoided her gaze. The pain was deep, harder to bear than any financial problem. That afternoon, Isabella received the news she had feared most. Rodrigo had sent her an email with a crucial update. The scandal surrounding the investment project had spread faster than they had anticipated. The media was already beginning to investigate, and without an immediate solution, Isabella would become the target of the press. The impact could be devastating for her career and her personal life. But instead of giving in to despair, Isabella knew she needed to act. She needed a plan. She knew she couldn't solve everything on her own, but she could at least try to minimize the damage. Wasting no time, she called an emergency meeting with her legal team to figure out what steps she could take. The meeting was tense. The lawyers warned her about the risk of prison, of a public exposure that would forever tarnish her image and that of her family. The scandal was about to take on greater dimensions. If you cooperate with the investigation, we can try to mitigate the sentences, but that will depend on your sincerity and your ability to resolve the situation, said the head lawyer. But honestly, it is difficult to imagine how you will get out of this without some kind of punishment. As she listened to the lawyer's words, Isabella felt a wave of helplessness. She knew the situation was beyond her ability to control. The weight of guilt was crushing, and every choice seemed to lead her to a dead end. But at the same time, she couldn't stop thinking about Carlos. She couldn't let everything they had built fall apart without trying. When she got home that night, a sense of desolation washed over her. Carlos was still not there. She walked through the house in silence, her footsteps echoing off the empty walls. The pain of seeing him so far away consumed her, and the question that haunted her mind was always the same. How could she save what was left? How could she redeem herself in his eyes? Carlos arrived late as usual, and Isabella was in the living room, waiting. She didn't know what to say, but she knew she couldn't put off the conversation any longer. He looked at her with a tired look, but didn't say anything. The tension in the air was palpable. "Carlos, please," Isabella began, her voice barely audible. "I know that everything I've done so far has been wrong. I've hurt you in ways I may never be able to make amends for, but I'm trying. I'm doing everything I can to make things right. I don't want to lose you. I don't want it to end like this." Carlos took a deep breath, and for a moment, Isabella had the feeling that he was trying to find words to ease the situation. But he didn't say anything. He just looked at her with a blank expression, as if he was trying to understand if there was still something left to save. "Isabella, you don't understand. I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know if I can ever believe in you again," he said, the pain in his voice as clear as the coldness of his words. "I loved you, but now all I see is someone who has lost himself in his own ambition. I don't know if I have the strength to go on like this anymore." Those words cut Isabella deeply. She felt an immense pain in her chest, a feeling of loss that she could not describe. But at the same time, a part of her knew that he was right. She had lost herself. She had neglected what really mattered to chase after something that now seemed empty. Carlos looked at her for a few more seconds, then turned around and went up to his room without saying anything else. Isabella stood there in silence. She knew she had lost her greatest support, the person who loved her. But now there was no more time to cry or regret. The scandal was at the door, and she needed to face what was to come. At that moment, Isabella made a decision. If she still had something to save, if there was a chance to turn this situation around, she would have to be brave. She could no longer hide behind the failures of the past. She had to face the consequences, no matter how harsh they were. Sunday dawned with a light breeze that tried to soften the heavy mood that hung over Isabella. She felt that the weight of guilt was beginning to become unbearable. Every thought that appeared in her mind was marked by the memory of her mistakes, her impulsive choices, and the pain she had caused Carlos, her greatest love. He was still in the room, and the distance between them seemed wider with each passing hour. Isabella knew that time was running out, that with every moment she did not act, the consequences of the business crisis became more profound. She could no longer wait for things to resolve themselves. Helping her career and saving her marriage required more than words. She would need concrete actions, and one of them would be to face the consequences of her mistakes with courage. She no longer wanted to run away. With a firm resolve to take control of the situation, she called Rodrigo. The lawyer had been her support during the last few days of turmoil. But she knew that in order to minimize the damage, she needed to be completely honest. She could no longer hide the truth. The weight of the lie was already too great. "Rodrigo, we need to act quickly. I know the situation has gotten out of control, but I am ready to cooperate with whatever is necessary to correct the course. I want to take responsibility, but I want to try to reduce the impact of public exposure." Rodrigo was silent for a few seconds before responding. Isabella, you're right. What matters now is that you take control of the narrative. The first step is to cooperate with the investigation, show sincerity, and try to ensure that the penalties are lessened. If you show that you are willing to correct the mistakes, there may be a chance to soften the consequences. Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. At least now she knew what she needed to do. But she also knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She was about to face a true test of character. Later that afternoon, after a heart-to-heart with her legal team, Isabella decided to hold her first public meeting with the press. She knew she could no longer control the information that was being spread, but she did have the power to control her reaction. And that was what she would do. She would come forward and take responsibility without excuses or justification. She needed to be transparent so that people would see her sincerity, but as she prepared for the press conference, the thought of Carlos haunted her. What would he think? Would he believe that she was really trying to change? Was there still any chance of saving their marriage? These questions raced through her mind as she prepared. That night, Carlos came home later, and the silence between them became unbearable. He didn't look for her, and she didn't call him. But Isabella knew that the truth could no longer be ignored. She decided to speak up as she had never done before. Carlos, I know that words will never change what happened between us. I know that I am destroying everything, and there may be no going back, but I want you to know that I am doing everything I can to make amends for my mistakes. I have made mistakes, and I can no longer hide them. But my biggest mistake was neglecting you, my family, because of my ego. And so, if there is any chance of us getting back together, it will be because I will fight for us. I want to make things right for me and for you. Carlos was silent for a moment, watching her with a gaze that was far from indifferent. He seemed to absorb every word, but his expression was that of someone still lost, still broken. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was cold. I don't know, Isabella. I don't know if what you're doing now will be enough, but I can't wait for you to tell me that you're going to change without seeing real action. If you want us to have a chance, show me, not with words, but with actions. Isabella knew he was right. Words were no longer enough. If she wanted him to believe her, she would have to show him that she was committed to changing. But the process would be long, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. She could no longer be the woman who hid behind her own ambition. She needed to be honest with herself, with him, with everyone. The next morning, Isabella addressed the press conference with her head held high, but her heart heavy. The room was full of journalists waiting for her first words. She knew that the judgment there would be relentless, but she could not delay it any longer. With a firm voice, she admitted the mistakes, the flaws in the project, and the negligence that caused the scandal. But she also publicly committed to correcting the injustices and doing everything possible to repair the damage caused. After the press conference, things began to change. Although the repercussions were not immediate, the reactions began to be more balanced. Isabella's transparency opened some doors, and the first opportunities for reconstruction began to emerge. But more important than that was the feeling that she was finally taking control of the situation, facing her mistakes and trying to fix them. Now, she knew the real battle was yet to come. It wouldn't be easy, but at least she wouldn't be running away anymore.